Thank you. Thank you so much for these kind introductions, and also for already introducing the panel, the distinguished panel we have with us today. I'm very honored to be able to moderate this session with you. We have been asked to discuss a little more detail today the question of reformed multilateralism, how we're pivoting towards equitable development. And I think this session fits neatly in the process of the Cape Town conference so far. Yesterday we spent a lot of time discussing G20 and BRICS, and I think what we were aiming to do now is to also take a broader view of the multilateral system. We have heard also, of course, a call for reform, a clear call for reform, the need that we need the system, and we need the multilateral institutions to deliver, to become fairer to a certain extent. And in this wake, I would like to maybe begin by asking the panelists in the first round, briefly, if you would like to pick out a change you would like to see in the multilateral system. So if we look at starting from a broad perspective, how we can both make it more equitable, but also more effective in delivering for sustainable development. Where would you start, or where do you see the main impetus that we will need at the moment in this current times, which we've heard a lot about this morning? The context is very difficult, but it is also very dynamic. So starting with this question, perhaps I will head over to Minister Tito Mboweni. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here for the Cape Town conversation. I think a lot has been said yesterday by President Mbeki, and also I think during the course of this morning about the unequal treatment of developing countries by the developed countries. I think the question that arises is not how to complain, is what to do. Because we have been sending petitions and so on, but these are not being replied to. So the key issue really is, can we develop other institutions which will then relate to the existing institutions in the process of change? My experience has been that of the formation of the G20 and also the BRICS system. And within the G20 system, our approach was, let us bring together those countries which are systemically important for the financial system, global financial system, so that we're not just reliant on those institutions and countries of the North, but also we can also use our own positions to influence the direction of movement. And within the G20 system, the original idea obviously was that we bring these systemically important countries. Actually, it was the ministers of finance and the governors of central banks which were in the G20 system. Then we made a mistake. We began to issue statements, and the heads of states got jealous, and they took over the organization, the G20. So it has become something else now. But within that G20 system, there was something that we called reporting on the observance of standards and codes. Now, that system was meant to help to ensure that we all move in the same direction. And then with the BRICS system, again, our attempt was not to undermine the IMF and the World Bank, but to provide a caucus so that when we go to the meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, we have a common position of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And again, it was the governors and the ministers of finance who were meeting before the meetings of the IMF and the World Bank to caucus a common position. Again, we made a mistake. We started issuing statements, and the heads of states got jealous. They also took that over into the BRICS thing. Now it's got big. But the final point I want to make was that given the difficulties which developing countries were experiencing with the IMF and the World Bank, we decided to form this thing called the BRICS Bank. In fact, the official name is New Development Bank, not BRICS Bank. Not to compete with the IMF or the World Bank, but in a sense, to provide a new way of thinking, which probably will also influence the behavior and approach of the IMF and the World Bank. Let me leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. So if we look at the institutions, and we heard this morning that Brazil will be looking particularly at the theme of inequality. So if you would like to look at the question of equitable access to institutions, I find it quite interesting that we have not so far heard the word General Assembly in this conference, because I think if there's one institution with one country, one vote that is most equitable, we have that. But where there's a lot of hope and a lot of aspiration looking at formats like G20 and BRICS and others, and we strive to make these formats inclusive and as possible. But from your perspective, Isabel Teixeira, when we look at the question of equitable development, what would you like to see in the way of reform in the multilateral system, and what expectations do you have regarding formats like the G20 or the BRICS, maybe vis-a-vis more traditional institutions?
Well, let's see. I think that we need to observe the big picture that multilateral system is facing today, consider different lands. And when you had in the past the multilateral system, you didn't have the crisis with nature as we have today. And this is so disruptive because it's not only based on the vulnerability and risks, but also in which countries would be able to access natural resource to make sure that they can provide development and inclusive growth. When you go into Europe, for example, you don't have the strategic reserves on minerals. Okay, it is true, but you have a carbon footprint 10 times bigger than the rest of the world, developing world. So if you want to change how Europeans and North, global North, are eager to change your footprints and to change your lifestyles. And this means international cooperation. Because when you go into global south, and you need to understand when you design it in a multilateral system, the climate regime and the biodiversity regime, this is the big picture of the crisis that we have today. Because we have the north with climate, and the south with the assets on biodiversity and natural resource. And if you want to provide solutions, we need to repicture things to understand what is the big picture today that must be changed. Of course, that we have CBDR, common by differentiated responsibility, etc. But you need to discuss what we have today in such a way that you can figure out not only innovative institutional arrangements, but also how international community should, must, and could come together when you go into this kind of debate. I'm not discussing here hard power. Okay, this is another phase of multilateral system, and we are dealing with this today. Okay, I'm discussing here how you come, as you provoke me, if you understand, to deal with inequality. It's not only social inequalities, it's also environmental inequalities. People will not be able to access natural resources in the future. And the other side of the coin is that we are getting older. have longevity, we need to understand the demands, additional demands of natural resource, that unfortunately we are not able to manage this, considering what we have today. So we need to come into this new reality. It's a global planetary dimension, and to understand that the challenge for developed banks, for finance system, how vulnerable we are, considering this disruptive crisis that we are facing today. So the international community and the international multilateral systems took decision in the past considering sustainability. And this, we need to make sure that we can have sustainability as a new expression of humanism in the world. Solidarity is part of this equation, but we need to understand how unbalanced we are today. And we need to recognize our mistakes, the both sides, okay? To make sure that we can go into the future with better alliance, and to make sure that the like-minded arrangements like G20, BRICS Plus, and other ones that are coming, okay? Why this is happening? Because we have new international dynamics in the world, new interests, new perspectives, new geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. My last comment, we cannot forget when you go into G20 or BRICS Plus, our GDP is bigger than G7. The world changed, and we need to understand how the world changed, and also the complexity that we have today. This year, next year, will be more complicated than this year. And then, but we cannot face the challenge on nature, and also another social inequality. Just what is justice for my country is not necessary for your country in Germany, okay? I understand this very well. But I think that we need to have an open-minded perspective to debate how would you like to come together, consider the future. That's why I mentioned earlier to have the future and the present, and to understand that the past is still with a real weight, but we need to understand that we need to change if you're not able to come together. We need to change if you want to have a new multilateral system. We need to change our mindset, our behavior, and to understand, as he's mentioned, the role of these new dynamics, economic dynamics in the world. Because, and my last comment, know that time is over, because when you go into money, public funds, private funds, we meet people committed, and this means co-responsibilities, and not only to ambition to be part of. And this is new in the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Handing over to you, Ambassador Chinhoy. So when we look at the multilateral system, is the solution in minilateralism, which is a term sometimes used for the informal groups that we have, the different Gs? Or how do you envisage taking forward the multilateral system to ensure that it is both equitable and inclusive and delivers on sustainable development goals, for example?
Thank you very much. From my point of view, when one looks at a world in considerable disarray, it is important to remember that geopolitical conflicts cannot really be wished away or prevented. What the world really needs to do is to think deeply about the kind of structures that we can create or improve upon that would be better able to either prevent or manage geopolitical conflicts. So therefore, it's instructive to look today at the experience of 100 years ago. When you look at the lessons of the 20th century, for me, it's very clear. The one big lesson is that without the fullest support of major powers, you really cannot have any effective multilateral structure. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 was a failure. So was the League of Nations that was attempted in 1920. And it did not succeed because the United States of America was never a member. And you can see that at the height of the League of Nations in the 1930s, between 1934 and 1935, there were actually 58 members, 7 more than the 51 members that created the United Nations in 1945. And yet the League of Nations was a complete failure because it was not able to prevent war, despite the Bryant-Kellogg Pact of 1928 signed in Paris. War could not be prevented. It could not prevent fascism. And therefore, in the 1930s, you could see how, firstly, Japan, Italy, Germany, much later in 1939, the Soviet Union, all left one by one. So that's a big lesson for me. The second big lesson is that despite the best of intentions on the part of major powers, you may be creating structures that may not be entirely very helpful or deeply thought through. Take the example of Franklin Roosevelt. Well before the Second World War ended, Roosevelt was speaking about the 4 policemen, that's the 4 sheriffs. He was talking about the spheres of influence that could be carved out by the 4 Globo Corps, that is the United States of America for the Western Hemisphere, the United Kingdom for Western Europe, China for East Asia and the Pacific, mind you. It's almost like prophetic in many ways, and the Soviet Union to look after East Europe. And this actually, at the end of the Second World War, led to a United Nations that is most inequitable. It started with inequity built into it. So I think best intentions also don't necessarily give you the best results without doing the kind of deep thinking that's required. My second point is that you don't need either minilaterals or maxilaterals. You need something that's balanced. Now take a look at the League of Nations. The League of Nations had no veto power, unlike this most inequitable UN Security Council at the moment. That's totally dysfunctional. And yet it failed. When you look at the G20, it's got the right kind of combination. It's got the BRICS in it, it's got the IBSA in it, it's got the G7 in it, it's got the P5 in it, and there is no veto. There's total equality. With the incoming of the African Union, you have another huge continent coming in. If the if the G20 were $85 trillion, 85% of the global economy of 100 trillion before the AU coming in, the AU has added US dollars 3.1 trillion. Now, I think we have to caution ourselves here that if we have a good dream team like the G20, and you saw that it's a dream team from the unanimity achieved in Delhi, is it necessary then to think closely about other structures, kind of assuming that role and undermining the larger structure? It's food for thought. For example, the G7 must not act like the UN Security Council, nor should it act like the UN Security Council inside of the G20. Similarly, the BRICS, the expanded BRICS, I have a little doubt on that because the new president of Argentina, Javier Milei, has already spoken about, lack of enthusiasm for an expanded BRICS. And when you look at the BRICS with $27 trillion worth of an economy before the expansion, what you have by way of addition is another 3.1 coming in as a result of the 6 new ones, of which 1/3 is, of course, Saudi Arabia. Do we need to have parallel structures, or should we concentrate on the one good A team that we have managed to create, that's the G20? And I don't think I would bank on a grouping like the G77, 135 countries, including China. Frankly, it's too disparate. And these are countries that today face binary choices. They're not in a position to really make their voice felt the same way, precisely because the most important major powers are not part of the G77. So let's concentrate on the G20. This meeting is also about, celebrating what we have achieved so far and taking stock of what needs to be done. Let's support Brazil and thereafter South Africa in making this G20 team the A team. No minis and no maxis required. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Andreas Schaal, you are representing an international organization on this panel, although it's one that has a very specific membership. And maybe from your perspective, and also, of course, from your experience as a G20 Sherpa for the organization, where do you see the role of perhaps picking up from Ambassador Chinoy, specifically the G20, in supporting effective multilateral system beyond the G20, and what are the conclusions you draw from the call for equity and such in regard to your own organization?
Thanks so much, Moira. Let me start by thanking ORF, Samir Saran, and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for organizing this incredibly important conference. I think we need to have more of these exchanges between different groupings, between so-called North and South, and really just out of the plane after 12 hours from Paris, and tomorrow I go to Delhi, but it was incredibly important for me to come here to have this conversation. Second point, let me reformulate maybe your question a bit, if you allow me, because I grew up in Germany, and in my youth the predominant feature was East versus West. And today I'm living 500 meters away from a bridge which was used to exchange prisoners and spies between East and West Germany. And the mantra for our generation was always rise up to the challenge and then change is possible. And this is something which is also important as a mantra for our discussion here. And I really want to leave with you this thought. I don't think that, and I want to take it up from Suchan, I don't think that this antagonism and dualism, G7 versus G77, G7 versus BRICS, also North versus South, responds to the complexity of the challenges in our world, food security, climate change. And I want to, here I'm completely with Isabella. We need to think these things new, whether we have the format needed for each of the challenges. And we at the OECD, we propose for that. I mean, I agree with Suchan that the G20 is an incredibly important umbrella, even if you check the Thabo by the heads of states. But also the heads of states bring dynamics, bring the need to kind of push for concrete examples, and India's presidency is one which delivered concrete examples. And we are happy to be, as OECD, the supporting cast. But what we are proposing at the OECD in this context is precise platforms for policy dialogue and joint action for advanced, emerging and developing countries. And this does not matter that we have no universal membership, but the topics we are discussing has universal coverage. And I give you just one example before I stop. We have just launched 1 year ago a so-called Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches to have an economic and more honest exchange of views, what countries are doing to reach their net zero emissions. And this is meant to have a real honest approach, and not that one group of countries tells another group, you need to have a price of carbon. There might be other alternatives who are equivalent to a price of carbon who lead to the same example. And I believe that we need to have more non-ideological, more pragmatic exchanges. And again, here I'm completely with Isabella, and I'll leave it there for this first round. Thanks so much. Hope that I did not deviate too much from your question, Madam Moderator.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for all the really valuable inputs. So one of the issues that we've touched upon over the last 24 hours and that might be worth taking a closer look, and you've mentioned the new development bank, Zimbrizi, is the multilateral development system, the multilateral development bank system. And I would like to maybe broaden this issue. We've touched upon IMF. We know that there have been some rather important reform steps taken at the World Bank, the annual meeting just a few weeks ago. But the system as such is more comprehensive. It includes much more levels, national developments. There are other regional development banks, of course. There are subnational developments of quite substantial size. How can we harness this system, and what is necessary to really address what President Mbeki yesterday mentioned about the funding gap, for example, regarding the SDGs? How can we increase the effectiveness of the multilateral development bank system? Is it new institutions we need? Is it better institutions we need? How can we address that the system as such works as a system, and that the different institutions deliver towards the common objectives?
Certain ideas are relevant at certain times. So if you were to ask me what is the most relevant question that confronts, say, the African continent now, I'll say the health care is really very important in Africa. Now, how do you achieve good health care? Well, then you go back to some of these things we're talking about. You go back to agriculture. You need food, healthy food. You need medical care, obviously. You need a population that's aware of its responsibility towards itself. So, what do? In Africa, we've got these vast resources, natural resources. Agriculture is very central, and we tend to ignore it, because food doesn't come from pick and pay. Food comes from the land, and the land must be tilled to produce this healthy food. But it doesn't help to have sufficient land for agriculture if we pollute the water and the rivers. Because then the food that is going to come from polluted water is of no use for healthcare. So instead of talking about these many goals that we have, I think we should just focus on some of the basic, simple things that we can do. And let's do them correctly. And by so doing, then add on the others as they come along. So I was saying at the beginning that certain ideas are relevant at certain times. Maybe when we were writing these Sustainable Development Goals, it was at a different time, written from New York by Jeffrey Sachs and so on. Okay. But we have to confront the African reality and the developing country reality, and see to what extent maybe we can leverage the friendships that we have around the world for our common purposes. But let's focus on these basic things and do them very well. Of course, the question then arises, if you have produced these foodstuffs I'm talking about, how do they get to the market? That's infrastructure, which is critical in the process. So I think we as developing countries, of course, the question arises, how are you going to finance infrastructure? How are you going to finance the tractors that you need for agriculture? And therefore, an institution like the New Development Bank becomes very important. But working together with the IMF and the World Bank and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Please, you'd like to pick up?
I have to answer this. Let's see. I'd like to highlight 2 or 3 things, because to answer your question, it's not who, it's not only who, to whom and why, okay, and how. You need to understand, okay, when you go into SDGs, I was a member of the panel of the Secretary General that proposed Sustainable Development Goals. I was also the head of delegation, Brazil delegations, in charge of the Paris Agreement negotiation, as Nagoya Protocol, etc., etc. I can tell different stories here. All the political conditions that host us during these propositions, they are over. In less than 10 years, everything's changed. So when you go into the debate of finance or even other things, we need to understand what are the demands, that are the priorities, if we want to deal with the future. And this is very important to observe, because you have inequalities, not only social ones. Infrastructure is a good example, technologies. But if you go into the technological trajectories, since the Industrial Revolution, all the criteria that humankind adopt to share things from developed to developing worlds, this impact so bad that you provoke additional inequalities because of the criteria that you adopt to share technology in the past. You have different studies about these reports, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have today, exactly the convergence of climate age, bio-wage that's emerging, and technological and digital wage. And we are discussing if we have a bipolarized world between China and the United States. We're still discussing this. It's impressive how we like to put the coins in the wrong baskets. Because if we go into inequalities, and you need to understand this, we need to understand which countries in the world could provide solution short-term perspectives. I come from a country that were able to solve hunger. We eradicate hunger in Brazil. Why this is back? We eradicate extreme poverty. Why this is back? We are the key food producers in the world. Why you have hunger in a country like Brazil? It's not only income problems. These are political perspectives, political problems. That's the problem that we have in the financial world. How would you like to finance things? We are proposing reform for multilateral institutions. Is the same institutions, or we have something fresh that allow us to access funds with transparency? Who will be able to be affordable to access these funds? We are doing the same project to make stronger the same institutions that the past were not able to solve the problems. Or you can be creative to come with new institutions. You can not only solve international reforms, you can go into international multilateral system, but we need to review institutions' capacity to deal with the challenge of this momentum in the world, not the challenge of the past. And we need to be coherent, because it's impressive that you don't have money to solve social inequalities or social risks, but you have money for wars with no barriers. It's impressive how people don't understand that climate change doesn't support wars anymore. Okay, I'm sorry, but we are really in a disruptive process in this planet. And we need to understand how we'll come into infrastructure and social inequalities to make sure that we're able not only to finance, and all of the argument is that the developing world, doesn't have capacity to provide projects. Why not? Tell me why not. But also, in our world, you need to face transparency, how to avoid corruption, how to go into the civil rights, how to manage not only social inequalities, how to go to preserve democracy. This is very important to understand when you go into multilateral system, when you go to debate things. And my last comment here, we need to understand what the new generations are asking for. They're there, they're coming, and they want to be part of this. So when you go into the financial world, how we can solve problems, et cetera, and we have different reports. I'm a part of different reporters consider climate finance, global finance. Let's assume something. Is developed finance the same of climate finance today? If you want to bring private sector today together with us, that everyone likes to talk about this, but we are prepared to share responsibility with private sector. What it means? What did it mean? Carbon price, nature price. We are able to value price, to value nature, for example, to be able to pay for this. And this is very important, that you need to bring something very important to the room, trade, international trade. The countries that are producers and the countries that are consumers. And let's discuss this in a new framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And in the spirit of inclusivity, we would like to take questions from the floor. And so I'd like to ask the remaining two panelists to practice the solidarity and time management. Picking up on what we heard on the... we're looking at the question of how we can come up with new ideas, thinking afresh. I'm sure the T20 process has come up with many ideas. We've heard some of them this morning. The panel with the private sector was also very invigorating in that way. Ambassador Chino, would you like to maybe highlight a couple of the points?
Thank you. Well, just because the world is dysfunctional in terms of the multilateral system doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. What we really need to do is to try and improve upon the existing structures that we have. And so the first point is the UN Security Council. It's never been reformed except once in 1965 when the non-permanent category went up from 6 to 10, taking the total number from 11 to 15. And the intergovernmental negotiations since 2007 have gone nowhere. So I think we need to do something about that. The second point is with regard to the MDBs and the IFIs. And I have a view here that when we take a hard look at the IMF and see its lending capacity about $952 billion, of that, the SDRs are only 426 billion. The rest is bilateral arrangements or new arrangements to borrow, which really means that once again, the developed countries are basically dictating terms there. And only once in 2007-8 have you seen voting rights being increased and an infusion of about $659 billion being made on a one-time basis at the end of the global financial and economic crisis. So I think the need of the hour is to see how we can expand this financial base that is available, get the IMF, the World Bank to work a little more closely with others like the ADB, the New Development Bank, etc. They work together and yet they don't, which also gives others, that is to say, country-specific banks from particular nations to actually overwhelm everything else. If you take a look at the 4 top banks of the People's Republic of China, you'll find that they have among themselves collectively capital worth roughly, market base there is something like $20 trillion. So if the bilateral track overwhelms the multilateral track, it's not good for the global system. And I think, therefore, we need to work together. The last point I'd make is that military expenditures have gone up by 3.7% year on year recently to touch $2.25 trillion in 2022. And by 2030, the world is going to need $5 trillion annually for climate finance alone. So it's time that we stop fighting wars to divert this capital to developmental finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite people from the audience who would like to raise questions. There are microphones left and right. Please make your way to the microphone if you have an interest in that. While we listen to Andreas Schall on this same topic, if you don't mind. I know the OECD is also strongly involved in the finance track of the G20, and that with your research and you've also given substantial impetus on this question. Where would you sort of pinpoint the most immediate efforts for effective financing?
Okay, Madam Moderator, let me just make 2 points in 60 seconds. First, climate finance. We are tracking the $100 billion commitment of advanced economies to developing countries. Data from 2021 show that we're coming closer, but we are not yet there. So we are now close to 86 million. But we need to kind of step up the efforts here, and we're tracking this. We also need to bring in more private finance, meaning that we leverage public with private finance. We have developed for the G20 in Indonesia, G20 blended finance principles. We are working as secretariat for the Paris Finance Summit, so we kind of try to really advance there. And second point I want to make is the point of domestic resource mobilization. Since 2009, we're working for the G20 with 169 countries in the Global Forum on Automatic Exchange of Tax Transparency, and there's Tito Mbobeni was minister when we kind of further advanced this exercise. And we have been bringing with this exercise that everybody pays its fair share, 1.7 billion euros to African countries in terms of domestic resource mobilization. And now we are working on the next step with the corporate minimum tax of 15%, making sure that big companies pay their fair share also in Africa. And this is something which is our contribution to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It seems like our audience is fully satisfied with the comments that have been made on the panel, or does anyone like to raise a question or make a comment? Then please do join me applauding this panel for the excellent comments they've made. I think I can summarize it that we, other than some other voices we've heard in the last 24 hours, I think the panel agrees in a very substantial but rather reform than a revolution in the multilateral system, and is definitely willing to contribute to taking this forward. Thank you very much.